I'm going to do is first start by talking about some of the key features of Apex Coach Views. First, Apex Coach Views 2 is the release that we're talking about. This is actually our third generation toolkit. This one is powered by Angular. It's a ground-up rewrite to take advantage of that super powerful JavaScript framework. The styling is all done with Bootstrap. It makes it beautiful and light and highly responsive. As I said, this is our third generation framework. We have hundreds of features that we've built on from our predecessors and incorporated the tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of hours of UI design work that we have done inside of BPM. It's very powerful and easy to use. Like ACV1, it lets business technical users build dynamic user interfaces. I would say in comparison to ACV1, it's even easier to use. We've been really focused on areas that were difficult for people to learn and found new and interesting ways to make that accessible for people. ACV is very fast and light. Coaches built with this load up to 50% faster than the out-of-the-box views and have page sizes that are up to 85% smaller. So that becomes more and more important as people build what are less, I would say, task completion screens and start to become more single-page apps like the one that you're looking at right here. Of course, it is mobile and responsive. They're great for setting up and doing mobile-first design and as well targeting traditional desktop development as well. We spent a lot of time in ACV2 finding ways to make Angular and the Coach View framework work nicely together, and we're really proud of what we've been able to accomplish. The result of that is it's very, very easy for you to style and extend Apex Coach Views. The page structure itself is very simple, and we have helper classes that make it very easy to style. So if you have even somebody with relatively modest CSS skills, they can quickly apply a corporate look and feel to ACV2. More importantly, you can actually customize the templates that we deliver for our own Coach Views and or create new custom Coach Views with only basic HTML skills. Whereas without Apex Coach Views, you basically would have to understand the entire Coach View framework, what we would have called level 3 skills, in order to build a new custom Coach View. With ACV2, you make a new Coach View, then you make its companion HTML template, and inside of that, you simply use a few bits of AngularJS markup to make the behavior of the view, make the view behave the way you want to. So you really only need AngularJS skills and light ones at that in order to be able to style and extend Apex Coach Views. We're excited by including not only reference material, but also online training is included directly in the set of examples that ships with the product. And finally, and still very importantly, this is available on all 3 levels of IBM BPM. You don't really need to wait for 8.5.5 to get all this responsive design capabilities. You can have it today in as low a level as 8.0. Okay, so those are sort of the high levels on Apex Coach Views. Kyle, how are the questions looking right now?
No questions thus far.
Okay, very good. So let's go on and stop talking about Apex Coach Views and take a little bit closer look about what's actually included. So in the reference tab here, we have the full list of Apex Coach Views as they exist. We have them organized into 3 groups. Ones that are about basically fields or displaying values, ones that are about layout of the page, and ones that are about adding behavior to the page. So if we take a look at these field views, text, multi-line, and masked input are 3 different ways to present textual information. Integer, decimal, currency, and percent, as well as progress bar are all numeric value presentation. date is sort of one by itself for handling date and time. Then checkbox, radio buttons, select, and look up are all about handling discrete values. And then finally, a couple of sort of specialized things, an image coach view and a link coach view for putting in links to other places. Each one of these is a link, and it brings up the reference page for that coach view. And the reference page is all the exact same help and information that you would find on the coach view itself. But when you're trying to learn what a coach view does and how it behaves, this is a very, very efficient way to do so. So basically, all the different standard properties as well as configuration options are listed here. And then there's an example field up at the top that shows how it behaves. So if we wanted to set the label to part number, you can see how it's displayed up there. And we can use some text for the help here. Visibility is pretty straightforward. Read only switches it out. There's no value in it at the moment. Required will make it a required field. You can turn the labels on and off, of course. And the binding value is what you've actually put in here. So if I put in a part number, oops, and you can see I've tripped up on the validity checking that we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so it's bound to a string. We have responsive width. So for example, you can see here we have 12, 6, 4, and 3. As we change the size of this, you can see that the field is jumping from half of the screen, full screen, half screen, third screen, quarter screen as we change the size. So that's how we handle responsive width. And you can also do things like just say 12 and 6. In other words, on a phone or something that is extra small, it'll be full width, and everything above that it'll be half width. Or you can continue on specifying additional sizes like that. The required message is displayed when it's a required field and you don't have a value. Placeholder text is what you see when there is no value. And then validation expression is simply a regular expression that can be applied to a text field. In this case, it's saying capital letters and lowercase letters, and the message that goes along with that, please enter letters only. So of course, if I hit a number here, it comes back and gives me that error message. Finally, there are styling for fields in Bootstrap CSS that lets you handle large, small, and the default size. So that is basically the text view. And Kyle, you'll interrupt me if there's questions. Are we still looking good?
Yep.
Okay, continuing on then, I'm not going to go through every coach view. I'm going to pick a few that highlight different capabilities. Currency is a form of a decimal field. You can see that the value here is bound to 5. It has the same capabilities up here for help text and labels and all of that. Same responsive width and placeholder text. This one, though, has a currency sign and decimals. Now, as I go in here and start typing, you see that the field removes its formatting. And when I come out of the field, it reapplies it again. So it's very nice from an editing point of view. You don't have to type in the currency symbol. You also don't have to type in the decimal places. It will add them for you automatically. The numeric fields all incorporate minimums with associated message. So you can see it has to be a minimum of 1. So if we enter in half, it says the value has to be less than the minimum. Likewise, a maximum. So if we go over 100, same thing. And there also is a message that's put in if you put in an invalid value. So for example, if I type in a like that, it'll say that the value is invalid. And the same thing happens if you try to type too many decimal places versus what was specified. So that is currency. Let's jump ahead and take a look at one of the discrete value coach views, select. Select is basically drop-down list. The values come from a static set of values bound to a list. So the options, as you can see here, look like this. It's, label, help text, visibility, again, all the same things. This one has something special. This and lookup have basically binding to a list. And you can see here our list has employee ID, first name, last name, full name. And we have two config options that control what shows. So you notice here that the display property is full name, but the employee ID is the value. So when I pick John Jones, the value is 2 because John Jones' employee ID is 2. And likewise, if I wanted to use first name, now you can see that the drop-down is reflecting those values as well. So that's just a small example of what we're doing with discrete values. There are similar capabilities for the other discrete value views like select and radio button and lookup. Continuing on, we're going to talk about layout views. Let me just tell you about them at a high level. Page is the overall container for every text coach view. It establishes and loads things up properly and connects to the right CSS and all of that kind of stuff. Then we have a series of layout views that correspond to concepts in Bootstrap CSS. Container is the thing that establishes margins. So you can see here that this one has a margin that as I change the window slightly, once it gets down below a certain size, it will jump. But it retains that consistent size, and that's a normal container. You also know up here that the header up at the top, the border of it is way over here tight against the left of the page. That's a full width container, and that's useful for things like headers, or if you have a very information dense page that you want to have stuff close up to the boundaries. Rows are what organizes information into logical rows. Columns group a set of fields within a column. Group actually lets you take a set of coach views and make them behave as if they were one. So as an example, on the text coach view, we didn't see this, but down at the bottom, you notice how these two buttons are kind of right together, and the buttons are just the size of their text. They're not like one column wide or two columns wide. That's because they're in a group that puts them together from a layout point of view. Dialogue you'll see in action in a little bit. Heading is used all over the place in this page. That's basically the ability to put in a heading level 1, 2, 3, 4 with some potential help text, and that's it. Row and column already let you do that, but sometimes it's nice to have heading all by itself. Tabs and tab are pretty self-explanatory. The tabs, of course, do progressive loading. So when we load up the page, it only loads the things that are visually there, and the rest of the stuff is not taking up memory. Table is what we use for both paginated and non-paginated grids. And then finally, when you need something beyond just a simple row column setup, we have a set of views complex table which allows you to specify inside of it one or more complex table rows. Those rows can be compound rows, so you may have two actual rows for each logical row, so you have 2 rows of information per item in the list. It also lets you put totals at the bottom and search fields at the top. And then complex table fat row, we had other less interesting names, but everybody just kept calling it fat row, so it's called fat row officially now. This is in case you want to have an expandable section in line in the table in order to edit or change information or have additional details about a row in the table. So you lay that out just like a row up here with rows and columns and fields and buttons, but it gets inserted in line within the table. That gives you a little bit of a sense of the layout coach views. Continuing on then on behavior, these are where things start to get pretty interesting. When you combine these things together with what you've got over here, you have a lot of very interesting patterns open up. Button is relatively straightforward, it would seem, but in fact it has lots of interesting capabilities. For example, you can see that this button is enabled, it's got a label and help text, and it can have different types of buttons styled according to whatever the Bootstrap style tells us about. There are responsive widths, of course. Interesting point, when you click the button, you see this binding. So these buttons have a Boolean binding, so when you click it, that value is set. And something else to notice is we can, at the same time, copy values. So we have a config option, assign from, assign to. This has simple text, and as we click the button, it copies it from here to there. That can be not only simple text, but also business objects as well. This is particularly helpful when you're dealing with lists that have buttons displayed as icons, and you want to know which item you are editing or deleting. You can copy the ID from the item to your generic item. There are different sizes available, large, small, extra small text. This is standard Bootstrap kinds of stuff. And you can also have it set the binding to false so that when I click it, oops, I guess I've got a problem there in my example. When I click that, it would set the binding to false instead of setting it to true. And I'm not going to update the icons, but you can see in other, you'll see in other ones, the buttons in action where we use a button in place of or an icon in place of this styled button sort of thing. So that's one of the behavior coach views. Validation scope and validation expression are really very interesting views because they give you client-side validation capabilities. The validation scope lets you say, whatever is inside of this section, if it's dirty or valid or dirty and valid, then set the button to true. Because of that, you can then disable and enable buttons based on fields that are filled in and valid, and I'll show you some examples in action later on. Calculate is also a really good and interesting client-side example. Here we have one example. The coach view itself has 5 operands. We're only using 4 of them here. Then it has an if, an expression, and an else expression. And basically, when the if is true, first of all, when one of its values changes, if this evaluates to true, then this expression is executed and the result is put into the binding. Otherwise, the opposite is put in. So if you watch the price here, as I click and unclick require shipping, you can see that it's just adding in the shipping cost. And likewise, if I change the percentage of discount, the price over here is changing as well. So imagine that you've got a table with items and quantities and prices, and you want to calculate the extended price dynamically over to the right calculated coach view for you. Interestingly as well, you can use it for aggregates. Here we have a list of counts, and Kyle has put in 3 different examples to illustrate it. We can put in sums, average, min, max, count 0, count non-zero, count null, count not nil. You can also use it for Boolean expressions. You can and a whole list together or and a whole list together. But in this case, we're taking the sum of operand 1. This list is what's bound to operand 1, and the star is the indicator to say, go ahead and sum up all of them. So you can see that as we change the values, the result is changing over here, whereas this one is the max. So you notice here as I continue to increase this one, as soon as I go beyond 7, then this changes. Likewise, the minimum. So if I decrement this one down and go below 0, then the min works as well. So that is a little introduction to the Calculate Coach View. It's sort of a Swiss Army knife of client-side calculations that business technical users can really get their arms around. This is no more complicated than putting a gateway on a service. Just drop in a Calculate Coach View and you've got logic, both numeric, string calculation, and Boolean logic. The other ones I'll just speak to. We'll see the call service in action. This is actually one of our most important pieces of technology here, and that is that, you know, as you start to build more and more complex coaches, you find that the default way of going back on a boundary event to get data every time you turn around becomes more and more problematic, because the more times you go back, the more lines you have coming out of your coach, and you end up with a big jumbled mess. So you need to be able to encapsulate reusable pieces so that they have not only their presentation, but also their behavior. So things like calculate and validation are important to be able to do that on client side, but the real kingpin is being able to call AJAX services. And what we've come up with is a way to have a coach view that is kind of like an adapter for an AJAX service. You just drag it in, and then it will go ahead and execute based on whether the inputs are changed or on load or on demand triggered by a Boolean changing value. So very, very powerful pattern. Window closed is a way to shut off or close out human services that the user just closes the browser window on. Very important for system performance to keep that clean. And we all know we can teach and teach and teach end users not to close the window, but they always are going to do that. Download CSVs is what it says. It's for downloading stuff into Excel out of lists. BPM document upload does basically the document management stuff. But this is a non-visual view, so you can decide how you want to lay things out. If you always want to upload only a single file and the user doesn't need to see the name, then you can just put a button on your coach that says upload and bind that to the trigger for this. Finally, capture image is a really fun one. That is to get at the camera capabilities of a mobile device in a hybrid app. The first production use of Apex Coach View 2 is actually a product image capture application running on an iPad in warehouses as items are shipped in that they don't have photos for. The warehouse receiving people are prompted to take a picture of that at a little photo station using an iPad running ACV2-based human service. So those are the overall set of coach views. Let me jump over to an example and run it just to give you a feel of seeing some of them working together. So this is a human service called Product Center, and Product Center is a fictitious custom portal. It has 3 different tabs: products, parts, and tasks. And the products one here is showing off table. It's a striped table. You can have tables with and without all the lines. It also has buttons over here in the right-hand column. These are actually buttons styled as icons, and they're grouped together with a group so that they sit nice and tight instead of taking up a specific column as we do here. At the top, we have a button that is styled as an icon and a link. So, for example, we can come in and add a product. Whoops. I waited around too long before I got to going. So we can add a product. And here you can see dialogue in action. You can also see we set these fields up in 2 columns to make it fit nicely inside of here. We can see we have 2 required fields. And the button, you notice, is disabled. It's a very light shade of green. After we fill in the required things, then it would give us the button turned on again. And here I want to also show you that not only can we validate stuff on the client side, but we can also validate stuff on the server side. So we want to check for a unique model number. So there, what has happened is as soon as we changed the value, we called an AJAX service to check to see if that was unique. It was not. A little message was displayed, and that made the section invalid, and therefore the button was shut off. And as soon as we make it unique, then it's good to go. We can have the limits on the price. And put in some top speeds. So it doesn't think it's possible to get to 60 at 0. So we'll put in a real value. And when they're all finished, then we can add the product. And you can see here that it has been added right up here. We can edit that product with another dialog using a different layout in this case. Or we can delete that product and it's gone from the database. You notice down here that we've got a paginated grid. This list was fetched via a boundary event leaving and coming back to the coach with the list. And when we would sort, that sorting is happening by going back out. The parts one is more interesting because this one uses an AJAX service to fetch. You notice here that we're on page 1 of 28,000 pages. There's 285,000 parts in the database that we just hit. And we can jump around here and it will go and retrieve the specific page directly. We can also page through or jump to the very end. And if we do sorting, sorting will actually be done on the server side. So there we've sorted the part numbers descending and then again ascending. So it can deal in the same way as we did on ACD1 with extremely large lists using paginated queries. The task list shows some interesting patterns, and if you know ACD1, you've seen these patterns before. But it is, again, a paginated list, so we're only seeing the 10 tasks that match our filters. And our filters up above are actually codependent. So that means that I can just type in something, like if I type in A, you can see that we have 3 different choices. So there's Laura, that's all Laura's tasks. Or if we clear that out, then we can filter by part number and take just the one part number that we see there. Now, when we go over to filter by assigned to, they're not codependent in this example. The queries here are not codependent. I thought that they were, but they're not. So that gives you a little bit of a feel. We also have shown the link column. So here we're showing an icon that would either run the process, so we can open up that task. It's not assigned to me, so it's not much good for me to do that one. Run this task. So gives you a little bit of feeling of what can be accomplished beyond just what we've shown you here. Now, that's a lot of content. What I want to do now is show you a little bit about how we're helping people learn this stuff and manage this stuff. As a part of this standard homepage, we also have built-in training and built-in training tracking. You can see here, and just for full disclosure, this right now is not live data. We're not quite wired up. We're in 0.8 of beta release, but this will be all wired in on the next one. So what it shows is what percentage of all the topics you've completed, gives you a little bronze or silver or gold accomplishment medal there, and tells you how many more topics are required to get to silver. And to set up a little interest, it takes all of the people in TW authors and finds what is your rank out of those people and then shows you in that list and what percentages they've completed. On the what's next side then, of course, are all the individual topics that you have started but not finished or haven't started yet in the order that you should take them. So basically, you can always just come here, click on the link, and go do that tutorial. So let's talk a little bit about the tutorials. This is the list of training that we've put together, and we are building them out. They will all be built before we go into production or go into a general availability. The simple, we have a set of sections. They start by doing a simple task completion user interface. So we build a coach structure with page and row and button and group. And I can show you just to give you a sense of what these lessons will look like. So there'll be some steps, usually 5 to 9 steps a bit of explanatory text, and then a picture of what you're supposed to be doing. And it'll continue on through each of the different steps. One of the things that I didn't talk about was down here at the bottom, there's additional further reading, so you can flip over to the references to the coach views that were covered. And then at the bottom it says, I understand this. That basically means I'm done with this lesson. Or I'll study it later and we'll just leave it in progress for the time being. So that lets them keep track of where they are and quickly make progress through learning Apex Coach Views. Also, if anyone notices anything, there's a link right on the page to take them directly to our support site where they can open up a ticket to help us get that sorted out. To finish up this simple completion task interface, we have a section on fields and data binding where they will put in various types of fields like text and multi-line and decimal and currency, and then learn how the responsive widths work so you can adjust the page sizes and see what happens. And then finally, third, we show them the basics of client-side validation. So we'll have some required fields and some fields with limits, min, maxes, and the buttons will disable. So that basically, after 3 short lessons, they'll be in business to do basic task completion UI. To take them to the next level, then, are a set of lessons that show how to build a custom portal. It'll talk about the coach structure using container and heading, as well as tabs and tabs. So now they've covered most of the different layout views. Presenting tabular data, so now they will have made a little grid with columns in it. Adding a add product dialog. Now they'll start to see how buttons can trigger Booleans that make dialogue show and go away, as well as using boundary events. The delete product dialog lesson will help them understand icons as buttons, as well as copying data client-side using buttons and setting or clearing Booleans using buttons. We'll add in a link column to launch a product homepage, and then finally add in some filters with type ahead, so they'll get to learn how to use the lookups. At that, you've covered most of the basics. We have a few catch-up items to sort of fill in any gaps, more fancy bits of columns and rows, including having columns and rows that are bound to lists and how they behave. We'll talk about how to control table column width. The default is, of course, using responsive columns, but you can also use pixels and percentages, and more importantly, hiding table columns on small devices. So in that same way that you specify the width of the columns, you can also identify which columns need to be hidden. Complex tables, that's where we'll get into the complex table row and fat row concept. And then we'll do something that's really pretty cool. A little bit further down, we'll talk about building a true custom coach view from scratch. This one is kind of a shortcut that uses a composite view that you put a custom HTML inside of it, and then you put the configuration right in there. So this will be actually showing a custom presentation of an address card, a nice compact presentation of a name and address. But it would be equally applicable, especially for tech salespeople when you're trying to do quick POCs. If you have a snippet of HTML that does something like Google Maps or whatever, and all you need to be able to do is connect that snippet to a couple of values from your coach, you can do that straight up with just a little bit of AngularJS. You won't have to write a load function and all that crazy JavaScript to make everything behave correctly. You should be able to accomplish it simply using a piece of custom HTML inside a coach view. Then they'll kind of graduate to a little bit more advanced topics. Calculating values client-side, so using the calculate coach view. How to do visibility expressions for the poor people who are still on 8.0. We know that 8.5 added visibility expressions, and those are really, really helpful, but some people still have to deal with not having those. Putting in business logic in client-side validation. So, for example, making sure that a list has a minimum number of entries in it before the button is turned on. That's what will be inside this one. Lazy loading paginated table using an AJAX service. Using AJAX service for that server-side validation, like that uniqueness. And then we'll talk about more advanced AJAX service patterns like on-load, on-demand, and when specific inputs change. And you kind of graduate out of that section by building a reusable encapsulated coach view that combines both the presentation and the behavior into one. Some additional topics that we'll cover: inspecting client-side values, just a little how-to on using Firebug and Angular tricks to be able to get to client-side values. And something else that we're quite excited about, we have just finished a feature to incorporate Google Analytics into Apex Coach Views. So the clients will be able to use Google Analytics to track page usage and what OSs and what levels and what screen sizes and how long people spend on pages, all of that kind of stuff. Basically, by simply putting your tracking code on the page coach view, it will automatically track everything, both at the page level, the tab level, and the dialog level. Really excited about that. Customizing and extending, we'll create a custom coach view from scratch. I described that process briefly. The second lesson will teach you how to make a custom build. So we take all of the HTML templates. They run just fine with HTML templates, but from a performance point of view, you don't want it fetching all of those from the server every time, even if they already are cached on the client. So what we do is a build system that puts together the JavaScript files as well as any of your JavaScript files and all the HTML templates, converts them to JavaScript and puts them into one big JS file. So when the user hits the page, there's one JS file. It's cached on their machine all the time anyway, and so performance is very good. The third lesson in this series will cover customizing our templates. So if there's something about our field templates, for example, that you don't like, maybe you don't want the help text underneath it, you want it something else, the hover or whatever. You could make a change, actually override our templates and redo the build, and all of the existing Apex Coach views will be intact. You would just use your templates instead of ours. And finally, we'll wrap up this section by talking about hybrid pages. How do you incorporate non-ACV coach views into a standard page? And I noticed we're missing a whole section here, which is the developing hybrid app. So I just realized we're missing that in the list of tutorials. So those are the tutorials. Then we are coming to the end here. First of all, what's new? There will be a new entry in this for each release. We've been working on 0.8 for a little over, I think, a week or a week and a half, something like that. This is all of the stuff that we have incorporated in that time frame. The Google Analytics, being able to deal with percent and pixel columns, relative URLs on images, adjusting padding between items in a group, putting on the control ID, moving all of the AngularJS, and you'll see later the Bootstrap CSS internally, the hiding columns, progress bar, lots of other ones. But basically the idea is that this will show up, and each one of these will show up as a new lesson, in quotes. And so when something new shows up and you install, your numbers over here are going to reflect, and right up here at the top of the list will be go and see the what's new page so that you know what's different.